Hey everyone, Pastor Bruce coming at you again, and I have a question. Where does our love for God come from? And how can we deepen that love? How can we grow in our love for God? The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And I think if we were to take a little survey, raising hands, how many of us could raise our hands and say, I love God with all my heart and all my soul and all my strength? How many of us could raise our hands? Or would we probably say, I could do better? My love is not what it ought to be. Well, that's what I want to talk to you about today. Where does that love for God come from? Of course, we know from 1 John that our love for God is a response. It's a response of God's love loving us. He loved us first. Therefore, we love him. We love because he first loved us in 1 John. Now, to get at this, I want to look at a story in Luke chapter 7. But I first want to go back to a verse that we looked at before, and it's this idea here of a good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. And I want to see the connection here between these two. There's something in the heart that leads to some produce. So you're producing something. Let's just call it fruit, okay? And I'm going to draw a picture here of a apple or cherry or something. And there's something in the heart. The good treasure produces good. So we're moving in this direction. This is a very important concept, especially for parenting, because in parenting or any kind of change of behavior, our focus tends to be on changing the fruit. But we see from this paradigm that the only way this fruit is going to change is to change the heart. So change the heart and you change the fruit. Now we might call this heart fruit, or the Bible also uses the picture of root and fruit. So if I use those terms, you're understanding what I'm talking about. Now, in the passage I want us to look at, we're first going to see the fruit. And later in the story, we'll see the root, what's going on inside of this woman's heart. So let's look at this. This is Luke chapter 7. Luke 7, verses 36 and following. Okay? One of the Pharisees asked him, Jesus, to eat with him, and Jesus went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at table. And behold, now this word behold, I think we've talked about it maybe before. Behold is stop, look, consider what I'm about to say. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she had learned that he was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair, the hair of her head, and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. This fruit is an act of worship. Don't you see? Doesn't it seem like worship? Her overflowing love for God. This is worship. And this is her actions, her fruit. This is what's coming out of her mouth, of her body. She is actually doing something. We call that fruit. It's what's going on the inside, that thing that we can't see, that is the root of this fruit. So let's take a look at what that might be. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet. So right away, he is making light of Jesus. He would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. You see what the Pharisee Simon is focusing on. And there's a lot of judgment going on, a judgment of Jesus and a judgment of this woman. And this interaction between these two people. And so Jesus has something to say about this. He says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said, say it, teacher. And so now he tells this story. And what I want you to do as we walk through this story is think about, what is Jesus trying to communicate? What is the main idea here? What is he trying to get across to Simon? A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii. Denarii is a day's wage. So think about how much you make in a day's for a day. And let's say you work 5 days a week. That would be 5 denarii. But this person owed 500 denarii. So that's well over a year and a half. Is it a year and a half of debt to this moneylender? And the other person owed 50. Now, you can see that one debt is 10 times the other debt. But this is no insignificant debt, is it? 50 days' wages out of your year of wages would be a lot of debt. So this is still a significant debt, even though one is 10 times greater than the other. So when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. So he is the moneylender, and he canceled the debt of both. So the 500 and the 50. Those two debtors no longer owe the money. Now, we have this question at the end of this story, which is where we're going with all of this. Now, which of them will love him, the moneylender, more? Which of them will love more? So we introduced this whole thing about how do we love more? How do we love God more? Well, we see one way here is that what Jesus is pointing to is the very answer that Simon gives. The one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And Jesus says, you have judged rightly. So the canceling of the larger debt leads to a greater love of the moneylender. Then turning toward Simon, or toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house and you gave me no water for my feet. but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, so here's the implication of all of this. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. Now, this would be a more appropriate translation. So let's just digress a little bit. This verb here, are forgiven, is in the perfect tense. And perfect tense means it's a past action with ongoing results. It's a past action with ongoing results. So if you just say are forgiven, it sounds like he's forgiving them now. But really, the proper way to translate this is, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. So she was forgiven in the past, which means she must have had some encounter with Jesus that we don't know about that led her to come and express her worship as she did. And we see here that it's because her sins are many. And what does that sound like? It sounds like the greater debt. The greater debt leads to she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And that makes perfect sense to us, doesn't it? Certainly Simon here doesn't really think much of Jesus. He's maybe putting on a good show, but it's obvious from what we looked at that he doesn't think much of Jesus. And he certainly doesn't think much of this woman. And so there's very little love on his part. Why? Because he's the righteous one. He's the right one, and he doesn't want that sinner touching him. And he can't believe that Jesus, if he's righteous in any way, would be allowing this woman to touch him. But what we see here is that her forgiven sins has led to much love. And he who is forgiven little, who sees himself as right, sees himself as good, who sees himself as the one who's, helping God and doing the right thing all the time, that person actually loves little. So how do we grow in our love for God? Well, from this passage that we looked at here, we have to appreciate, reflect on the many sins that we have. The more deeply we think about how broken we are, how rebellious we are, how much we want to do our own thing and wish God would get on board, the more that we see our sin, then the more we will appreciate the forgiveness that took place. And as a result will come the love. So this inner sense of forgiveness, that's the heart. This is the heart, that the root of this woman and her expression of worship we saw up above. So again, how do we do this? There's two things we have to keep in mind. The first thing that we already talked about was we have to get an accurate sense of who we are without God. We need to know our sin. We need to know, even with God, how um, how we tend to want to walk away or do our own thing or want God to be on our team instead of us seeing God as the God of the universe. So, getting to know our deepest sins, number one. Number two is understanding what it cost the moneylender. Remember, the moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 and the other owed 50. Well, that is a lot of money. And that moneylender has to just write it off. It was money he had that he no longer has. It cost him a lot. In fact, it cost him more than what each of them owed. It was two debts that he was carrying that he forgave. And when we understand the depth of our sin, number one, and number two, understand the cost to the moneylender, then our love for the moneylender, or in this case, our love for God, will grow. So I hope you take some time to reflect on this and that this gives you some understanding on how you can grow in your love for God. We'll see you next time.